Welcome to Tennessee's at-home learning series for math. Today's lesson is for all our 7th graders out there, though all children are welcome to tune in. This lesson is the 9th in our series. My name is Kayla Anderson, and I'm an 8th grade math teacher at Rocky Fork Middle School in the Rutherford County School System. I'm so excited to be your teacher for this lesson. Welcome to my virtual classroom. If you didn't see our previous lesson, you can find it on the Tennessee Department of Education's website at www.tn.gov/education. If you don't already have the student packet for this lesson, you can find it online at www.tn.gov/education. You can still tune into today's lesson if you haven't seen any of our others. But it may be more fun if you first go back and watch our other lessons, since we'll be talking about things today that we've discussed previously. Today we will be learning about how to use adding and subtracting of rational numbers to solve real-world problems. Before we get started, to participate fully in today's lesson, you will need paper, pencil, and a surface to write on. Okay, let's get started. Sam and Shamir are simplifying this expression. 6 1/2 subtract -10 plus 3 1/4. Sam says the answer will be negative since the 10 is negative and it is larger than 6 1/2 plus 3 1/4. Shamir disagrees. He says that the answer will be positive, and because all the numbers are positive and being added. Who do you agree with, Sam or Shamir? Well, let's take a look at this. First, Shamir says that it's going to be a positive answer because all of those numbers are positive and they're all being added. When we look back up here, we've got subtraction and a -10. So we need to figure out whether Shamir is even correct in his statement about them all being positive and being added. Remember in previous lessons, we've discussed this phrase of adding the opposite. And we've discussed that you can leave the first addend the way that it currently is, so 6 1/2, and then you add the opposite of that second addend. So we change subtraction to addition, and we're going to be adding the opposite of this second addend. Well, the opposite of -10 is +10, and then we have plus 3 1/4. So now that we've changed subtraction to adding the opposite, who is correct? Who do you agree with, Sam or Shamir? Very good. Shamir is correct. He is correct because when you add the opposite, every number is positive and is being added. Today we will use this kind of reasoning to help us determine if our answers are reasonable. Let's get started. Here's our next problem. Hummingbirds sip 2 1/2 fluid ounces of the food in a feeder. Then 1 1/2 fluid ounces are added to the feeder. Last, hummingbirds sip another 3 1/4 fluid ounces of food. What is the overall change in the amount of food in the feeder? Let's write an expression that represents this situation. I'm going to pause so that you can go ahead and write an expression on your paper. Did you get -2 1/2 plus 1 1/2 minus 3 1/4? I hope so. Why are the 2 1/2 and the 3 1/4 negative? Is the 3 1/4 actually negative? Both of these numbers represent food being taken away from the feeder. So yes, when we add the opposite, so remember this phrase that we've used, adding the opposite. I'll leave this addend. Gonna leave this addend, and remember that we add the opposite. Well, the opposite of 3 1/4 is negative 3 1/4. So yes, both of these values are negative, and they are negative because they represent food being taken from the feeder. So now we have this expression. Why is the 1 1/2 positive? It's positive because it represents the amount being added to the feeder. Do you think the overall change in the amount of food will be positive or negative? Why do you think that? Did you say that the answer will be negative? Great. There is more food being taken away than is being added. Good job. So when you look at what's being taken away is more than what's being added. So the overall amount of food is going to be negative. Great. Now let's determine the answer. I will show you one way that we can simplify our expression, and we will talk through it together. So the first thing that I'm going to do is decompose this negative 2 1/2. And I can decompose this negative 2 1/2 to be negative 1 1/2 plus negative 1. So before we move on with the rest of this expression, let's concentrate on why this can be decomposed. So I'm not changing the value of this number. I'm just decomposing it and writing it in a way that will make my addition and subtraction a little bit easier as we move along. So negative 1 1/2 plus negative 1 does equal negative 2 1/2. We've just decomposed it to make our work a little bit easier. I'm going to continue on with writing the rest of this expression. So plus 1 1/2 plus negative 3 1/4. Now, how did the decomposing help me, and why would we go through the time of decomposing that? Well, negative 1 1/2 plus 1 1/2 are opposites of one another. And remember that when you add opposites, they equal 0. So when I add the negative 1 1/2 plus 1 1/2, they equal 0. So to continue simplifying my expression, I now have negative 1 plus negative 3 1/4. I'm going to add those numbers together to get negative 4 1/4. Now let's talk about what that answer means in the context of our problem and whether or not it is reasonable. So remember when we had a conversation a second ago, we talked about whether the overall change would be positive or negative. And we said that it would be negative because there is more being taken away than is being added in. And we did get a final answer that's negative. So it is reasonable. What does this negative 4 1/4 mean? Right. It means that the overall change in the amount of food in the feeder was negative 4 1/4 fluid ounces. Great work. Okay, let's try another one. A helicopter is 19 1/4 meters above the top of a canyon wall. It goes down 27 1/2 meters, passing into the canyon. Then it goes up 5 1/4 meters. What is the new position of the helicopter relative to the top of the canyon wall? Okay, so what strategies have we learned this week that might help us solve this problem? You are correct. We can draw a diagram or we could draw a number line. Both of those are great ideas. Let's draw a diagram and see if that helps us with our expression. we're going to start out with the top of the canyon wall. And we know that the helicopter is 19 1/4 meters above the top of the canyon wall. We'll label that as our helicopter. So here's the top of the canyon wall. The helicopter is 19 1/4 meters above the top of the canyon wall. What happens to the helicopter first? Right, it goes down 27 1/2 meters. So how can I show that the helicopter goes down 27 1/2 meters? Good, so I'm going to draw myself an arrow down, showing that it's going down. Now, when I draw this arrow down, is the helicopter still going to be above the canyon wall, on the canyon wall, level with the canyon wall, below the below the canyon wall? Right, because it's going down 27 1/2 meters, it's going to go down below the top of the canyon wall. Okay, are we finished? Right, then the helicopter goes up 5 1/4 meters. Now, if it goes back up 5 1/4 meters, is it going to be back level with the top of the canyon wall, above the canyon wall? Where's it going to end up at? Right, so we're going to show that it goes up 5 1/4 meters, but it doesn't look like it's going to make it back to the top of the canyon wall. Okay, so now that we have our sketch or a diagram to help us out with this, let's write an expression. If the helicopter starts at 19 1/4 meters and then drops 27 1/2 meters, how could we represent that? You are correct. We can subtract. How would we then represent that it's rising 5 1/4 meters? Right, again, we could add. So what would our expression look like to represent this problem? Go ahead and write it now. I hope the expression that you came up with is 19 1/4 plus, we're going to start out with subtraction actually. The first thing that it did was decrease, so we're not starting out with a plus. So subtract 27 1/2 plus 5 1/4. Let's double check this real quick to make sure it makes sense. So the helicopter started out 19 1/4 meters above the top of the canyon wall. That's why it's positive. It went down 27 1/2 meters. That's why we've used subtraction. And then it went up 5 1/4 meters. So we've used addition. So what would our answer be? You go ahead and work out the problem, and then I'll work the problem out and we can compare answers. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this. Remember that we talked about how you can reorder addition so that it's a little bit easier to work with. So I'm going to reorder this so that I have 19 1/4 plus 5 1/4 together, and then I'm going to subtract the 27 1/2. So when I add 19 1/4 plus 5 1/4, I get 24 2/4. Remember that 2/4 is the same as 1/2. So 19 1/4 plus 5 1/4 is 24 2/4, which is 21 1/2, or excuse me, 24 1/2. And then we're going to be subtracting the 27 1/2. So what is 24 and 1/2 subtract 27 and 1/2? You are correct. It is -3. Did you get that answer? Awesome. So what does the -3 mean in the context of the problem? That's right. It means that the helicopter is 3 meters below the top of the canyon. And if you go back to our drawing, it does make sense that if it started here, went down 27 and 1/2 meters, came back up 5 and 1/4 meters, it is going to be 3 meters below the top of the canyon wall. Awesome work. You're really doing a great job. Let's work some more problems. As you work the problem, think about whether the answer you get is reasonable. Ask yourself, does your answer make sense in the situation? Just like we did here. We thought about whether this -3 made sense in the situation. Just like we did with our hummingbird problem, where we thought about the fact that our final answer was negative made sense because there was more being taken away than there was being added in. So here's our next problem. Cece's dog loses 1 1/4 pounds. Then her dog loses another 1 1/8 pounds. Finally, he gains 3/8 pounds. What is the total change in her dog's weight? Show your work. Remember to think about the different strategies you can use to help you understand and solve the problem. When you finish, check to make sure your answer makes sense. I'm going to pause for about a minute while you work this out and think about whether your answer makes sense, and then we'll come back together and solve this. Okay, let's look at this problem together. What expression did you write to solve this situation? See if yours matches mine. -1 1/4 minus 1 1/8 plus 3/8. Okay, why is this 1 1/4 negative? Right, because the dog loses 1 1/4 pounds. Why is this 1 1/8 negative? Right, because the dog loses another 1 1/8 pounds. And then why have we added a positive 3/8 here? Right, because the dog gains 3/8 pounds. Okay, so let's do some subtracting here. Keep in mind when we start with our subtraction that we're going to need a common denominator. You have a common denominator of 8 here. So -1 1/4 is the same as -1 2/8. Instead of subtracting, I am going to add the opposite like we've been working on. So I'm going to change subtraction to addition, and then the opposite of 1 1/8 is -1 1/8. And then we still have plus 3/8. So just a second ago when we were talking, I asked you why is this 1 1/8 negative? And you can see by adding the opposite that it is in fact a -1 1/8 because the dog is losing those pounds. All right, so -1 2/8 plus -1 1/8 is -2 3/8. Then we're going to add 3/8. So what is our final answer? You are correct, -2. So what does this mean? Right, Cece's dog lost 2 pounds. Does that answer make sense? Well, we can use the whole numbers to check. The dog lost a little over a pound. Then it lost a little over another pound. So that's a loss of a little over 2 pounds. Then it gained a little less than half a pound back. So it would still have lost close to 2 pounds. Great work. Here's another problem. In chemistry class, Carrie is mixing solutions together for an experiment. She mixes 5 1/2 ounces of solution A and 8 3/4 ounces of solution B. She then needs to remove 3 1/4 ounces before adding 6 3/4 ounces of solution C. What is the volume of her final solution? Write the expression, solve this problem, check to see if your answer is reasonable, and then we'll go over it together. Let's go over this problem to figure out how many ounces Carrie has in her experiment. Let's write the expression. 5 1/2 plus 8 3/4 minus 3 1/4 plus 6 3/4. So we do need a common denominator here when we add these together. Remember that 5 1/2 is 5 2/4. Keep the rest of our expression. Okay, so remember that we do addition and subtraction in order from left to right. So 5 2/4 plus 8 3/4 is 14 1/4. Now let's subtract 3 1/4. 14 1/4 minus 3 1/4 is 11. Now we'll add 6 3/4. So Carrie's experiment's volume is 17 3/4 ounces. Did you get it? Great work. Let's do one more problem together. This one is about hummingbirds. Hummingbirds sip 3 3/4 fluid ounces of the food in a feeder. Then 8 1/2 fluid ounces are added to the feeder. Last, hummingbirds sip another 4 3/4 fluid ounces of food. What is the overall change in the amount of food in the feeder? Work this problem, and then we'll go over it together. Let's see how you set up this situation. Negative 3 3/4 plus 8 1/2 minus 4 3/4. Why are 3 3/4 and 4 3/4 negative? Right, they are negative since the hummingbirds have sipped the food. Here we need a common denominator. 8 1/2 is the same as 8 2/4. Negative 3 3/4 plus 8 2/4 is 4 3/4. Now let's subtract 4 3/4. Wait, that's 0. What does that mean in this problem? You're correct. There isn't a change in the amount of food in the feeder. It is the same. Does that answer make sense? Why? It does make sense because the amount that was sipped is the same as the amount that was added. So there is a 0 fluid ounce change in the amount of food in the feeder. Great work today, 7th grade. Today we reviewed using addition and subtraction of rational numbers to solve real-world problems with a focus on fractions. You sure did a great job. After the video, you will have some problems to practice on your own. I will show you the independent practice problems now. Here they are. Or you can find them in the student practice for this lesson posted on our website, www.tn.gov/education. Good luck and do your best. Here are those problems if you'd like to take a look at them now. All right, guys, I enjoyed reviewing how to use adding and subtracting of rational numbers to solve real-world problems. Thank you for inviting me into your home today. I look forward to seeing you for our next Tennessee's At Home Learning Series lesson. Bye!